Shalom, Shalom, Mashpaka. Welcome back to Straight Gate. This is part two of the 1619 Virginia's First Africans, and we'll pick it back up where we left off. And it reads, in 1624 and 1625, the largest groups of Africans in Virginia were at Flowerdew 100, present-day Hopewell, at or near Jamestown, and at Edwards Bennett's plantation near present-day Smithfield. In Elizabeth City, formerly Kickinton, now Hampton, Anthony and Isabella are first described by name in 1624. Sometime in 1624 or early 1625, they had a son, William, who was baptized. In the 1625 muster, they are identified as Anthony Negro, Isabel Negro, and William Fair Child baptized. The locations and dates of William's birth and baptism are not known, though the baptism probably took place at Elizabeth City's parish church. They labored in the household or on the land of Captain William Tucker. Consequently, they are often described as Anthony, Isabella, and William Tucker, though they never appear with this name in the historical record. The child William is often described as the first African child born in America. However, there is a second child listed in the 1625 muster at Flowerdew 100, and no records indicate which child was born first. Like all Africans at Flowerdew 100, the second child's name is unknown. No other written records of Anthony, Isabella, and William exist, though unwritten local traditions have found their way into many narratives. By 1625, John Pedro was also living at Elizabeth City in the household of Frances West. Angelo or Angela, an African woman, was described in both lists at the residence of William Pierce at Jamestown. In 1625, the muster notes that Angelo arrived on the treasure, meaning she is the earliest African whose arrival can be individually dated by name, though the vast majority of the Africans in Virginia arrived on the White Lion in 1619 or Treasure 1619. No records place any other Africans by name firmly on either ship. Were the first Africans indentured servants or enslaved? Indentured servitude happens to be when there's a contract involved. Indentured servitude is when a contract is involved and you are released from said service as a servant, but giving reparations for whatever that said punishment of servitude was for. Enslaved or chattel slavery is when you're forcibly put in a position where you serve and aren't giving any restitution and reparations. That's the difference, right? So, reading on. Because of the absence of clear records, it is possible to know for sure, however, the existing evidence points to most Africans being treated as enslaved beginning in 1619. We can go into Deuteronomy chapter 28 and 48, and it reads, Therefore shalt thou serve thine enemies, which the Most High shall send against thee, in hunger and in thirst, and in nakedness, and in want of all things. And he shall put a yoke of iron upon thy neck, until he have destroyed thee. right? This is in our scriptures in Deuteronomy chapter 28 and 48. And here you can see the photo or depiction of that said prophecy and scripture correlating to the image in what you see in front of you, right? We'll dive back into this. I want to make sure that all my screens are doing what they're supposed to do. Okay, boom. Certainly, they arrived in Virginia enslaved. They were clearly not indentured servants. However, some early Africans may have had more opportunity to become free than was possible under hardening racial attitudes later in the 17th century, right? So, as we can see here in this imagery, they had the opportunity of becoming free as you can see here, they're being auctioned off, here, right? So I just wanted to just put some imagery together for you, so it's more cohesive when we're reading. Historian Alden T. Long summarized it best. Computer acting funny now. The evidence from Virginia and elsewhere refutes the popular myth that slavery was rare or non-existent before the legislation of 1660s and 1670s, that free blacks were numerous, and that most blacks were indentured servants. The surviving records support a very different distribution. Slavery from the outset for the vast majority, freedom for some by a variety of means. A variety of means, right? You were considered a free servant by a variety of different means. A temporary servitude, rarely with a legal indenture, for the smallest number. Vaughan, The Origins Debate. There is no smoking gun for slavery in early Virginia records. However, there is an overwhelming evidence from Virginia and other English colonies. The Africans aboard San Juan Bautista were transported from the port of Luanda in Angola and bound for America as property, as pirate loot. They were stolen goods, and they were traded for goods and resold when reaching Virginia. At every step of their journey after their capture, they were considered commodities or property. So here it says they were stolen goods, right? Give me 1 second, I'm looking up a verse. I probably should have had this queued up, but you know. 1 second, be patient, please. Go. Revelation 13. trying to show you in scripture where what happens when you steal or kidnap people, right? What the punishment is for taking property according to people, right? Here, this tab. So right here is Revelation 13 and 10, and it reads, "He that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity. He that killeth with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and the faith of the saints." So what the Most High has said in His Word is that those who have taken people and led them into captivity and or bondage, hence slavery, will then therefore go into captivity, bondage, and or slavery. Thus saith the Most High. Right? This is all to support biblical scripture and stand on it as truth. Right? Sorry that took so long. Picking it back up. The Africans aboard San Juan Bautista were transported from the port of Luanda in Angola and bound for America as property, a private loot. They were stolen goods, and they were traded for goods and resold when reaching Virginia. At every step of their journey after their capture, they were considered commodities or property. So it's showing you how this form of commerce, selling Africans, were used as goods for trading. In scriptures in Deuteronomy 28 and 68, it says they will sell their boys and their daughters for wine and all kinds of commerce, whatever they had going on at the time, whatever. But at the latter portion of this, it says they were considered commodities or property, right? So at what point in history did this stop? What point in history were these captives that were kidnapped and stolen from a land restored, given back restitution for chattel slavery, and taken back to where they originally came from? Or did this seed, this beginning process, just turn into something else? Did it just manifest into something else, right? And it's just being labeled as freedom. By 1619, slavery was a familiar institution in England. English colonies and throughout the English Atlantic, enslaved Africans were present in England, and Africans' status was understood when they arrived in Bermuda and Virginia. English mariners had long been involved in the slave trade as pirates, preying on Spanish or Portuguese ships and colonies. In 1562, pirate John Hawkins was the first Englishman to complete the triangle trade and transport captives from Africa to the Americas for sale. Along with Hawkins, Sir Francis Drake often stole and traded enslaved Africans. In the 1610s, English ships regularly traded captives raided or brought from Africa or Spanish settlements in Africa. Enslaved captives were one of the most common forms of loot for the Earl of Warwick's fleet of privateers, including treasure. Warwick was also a founding investor of the slave-trading Guinea Company, 1618. In the 1624 census and 1625 muster, many Africans are not identified by any name. Um, of those with first names, none has a surname. Rather, they are identified as Negro. By the late 16th century, as English participation in the Atlantic slave trade grew, the words Negro and slave were used interchangeably. Negro or negro in Spanish just it means the color black. So I'm going to throw it out there and say that maybe they were called Negro, deriving from the word negro because the Spanish slave trade was predominant, and that's probably what they named their commerce, Negro, right? Um, 17th century English missionary Morgan Goldwyn observed these two words, Negro and slave, being by custom grown homogeneous and convertible, as even as Negro and Christian Englishmen and heathen are by the like corrupt custom and partiality made opposites, thereby as it were implying that the one could not be Christians, nor the other infidels. The Africans from the treasure were very clearly described as slaves in Bermuda records. Bermuda's political and legal structures resembled Virginia's in this period, and there were intimate trade and political links between the two colonies. For a time, Bermuda was operated by the Virginia Company. As in Bermuda, Africans introduced to England's other Atlantic colonies, Barbados, New England, etc., in the early 17th century seems to have instantly coincided with the assumption that Africans were enslaved. There is no reason to believe Virginia was an exception to this pattern. Africans' baptism or conversion to Christianity did not seem to alter their status in English colonies, for the English Christian was an ethnic racial distinction rather than religious identity. In wills and other legal records in Virginia and throughout other English colonies, African laborers were consistently listed with valuations much higher than white servants, indicating a likely expectation of lifetime service. No evidence supports the myth that Africans were ever regarded or treated as indentured servants. They were captured in wars and raids and did not negotiate an indentured contract. There you go. Unlike white servants, whose practice of indenture is well documented, the only blacks that seem to have been indentured, for example John Philip, appear to have arrived via England, where they may have had the opportunity to negotiate contract terms or enter into an indenture voluntarily. Some Africans were able to become free. Some likely took advantage of comparatively loose, though significant, racial restrictions and purchased their freedom, while others may have been treated more similarly to white servants and released after a certain number of years. However, there is no evidence that this practice was commonplace, and there was no legal reason for masters to release them. The experiences of free blacks were exceptional. Right? This portion here is pretty good. Slavery and Christianity. Now, it's going to probably go into how Christianity, a form of religious bond or bondage, is put on, the custom of Christianity is put on for certain conditions, certain outcomes, right? Until later in the 17th century, Christian had an ethnic, cultural, and racial definition rather than referring to someone's religious identity or beliefs. Christian meant someone from somewhere within Christendom, i.e., Europe. For example, the 1620 Virginia census identified Africans as others not Christians in the service of English. So right here, it says that the Africans that were taken from the different portions of Africa and that continent were not originally considered Christians or labeled as this identity of Christians when they were brought over here, but rather than they were labeled as others not Christians in the service of the English. Reading on. In 1630, a white settler was whipped for mixing his Christian body with a heathen one by fornicating with a Negro. And we know that within our scriptures, we're told not to mix, right? Do not mix. It adds confusion. By fornicating with a Negro. In 1662, a Virginia law prohibiting interracial sexual relationships imposed a fine if any Christian commit fornication with a Negro man or woman. This assumption was a strong feature of English Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture, but less so of the Iberian Catholic worldview. So we see here, it's opening up how Christians and Christianity, Christendom, derive from a portion of a Catholic worldview, right? Going back to something. This is why the English were able culturally to adapt so easily to the practice of enslaving Christian Africans. So now we have a new title here, Christian Africans, whereas it was outlawed in Catholic countries. Even so, Portuguese enslavers were required to nominally baptize Africans before they were exported from Angola. This definition of baptized, it didn't mean they rounded so-called Africans up, dunked them in water, and said, "Be on your way, you are now a Christian." Baptism is a form of indoctrination. When someone is being baptized, it's being taught, in most cases forcibly taught, and what this might have been, or as in now in today's term, being baptized is more or so less delivered in an eloquent and entertaining way when someone is being baptized, right? That's the definition of what baptism is. From the 16th century until the early 20th century, English British colonizers tended to consider non-whites not following Eurocentric cultural norms as heathens, regardless of whether they had converted to Christianity as a religion. Religion is a man-made practice, right? Religion is all man-made. The process of transforming Christian identity from an ethnic, racial one to a religious one began in earnest with the evangelical impulses of the First and Second Great Awakenings of the 18th and 19th centuries. Unlike Catholic France, Spain, and Portugal, English Protestants made very little effort overall to convert non-white, non-Christian peoples until the two awakenings engendered widespread evangelical efforts. So now they're trying to, now it's growing. Far more often, converting non-whites to Christianity was used as justification for colonization, right? So now you see, Christianity, or this man-made religion, was used to baptize or indoctrinate people into customs and beliefs that weren't theirs originally from their own homelands and their own practices, but now had to conform in a way to fit into this society or this colonial mindset as integration, right? But actual missionary operations were paltry or non-existent. Early English missionaries also distinguished between Indians and Africans. And here it's telling you and showing you that on this same landmass now, you have so-called Indians and now Africans being integrated into Christianity. While there are some organized efforts to Christianize natives, especially in Puritan New England, there were no major efforts for Africans until the 18th century. From Virginia, narratives like Richard Hakluyt and John Smith's emphasized the possibility of native, cultural, and religious conversion was a way to whiteness, like Pocahontas, baptism, and transformation into Rebecca Rolfe, but dismissed the ability of Africans to become civilized, right? Not only were the indigenous people of different land masses colonized through different forms of religious practices from other places, but they were also transformed by mixing and blackiamento, the skin color, right? Because believe it or not, there is some, probably many so-called Shemitic people, Negro descent, as one were to say, that are of a palm-colored people. This is why we don't get into skin doctrine, but our spirit bears witness with one another, right? Reading on. Some historians believe some of the Africans on the San Juan Bautista may have been Christianized, in part, or in whole or in part, since many had Christian European names, and therefore may have been baptized. Portuguese Catholic missionaries had been active in West Africa for over a century by this time, and some Christian Africans from Congo and Ndongo were being enslaved by the Portuguese. The Bishop of Angola lodged a complaint against the practice in 1619, claiming that over 4,000 of the captives exported from Ndongo were Christians and had been enslaved illegally. But there is no clear evidence indicating what the religious beliefs of the Bautista Africans were. Africans' baptism or conversion to Christianity did not seem to alter their status in English colonies, so it didn't do nothing for them, right? It didn't come with any perks or benefits. They were just now taking on the mindset to be colonialized. Two Virginia legal suits illuminate this problem further. In 1656, Elizabeth Key sued for her freedom, arguing that she had been baptized. She had been bound for a finite term rather than for life, and her father was a free white man under English common law. Children took the status of their father. A 1662 Virginia law confirmed children would take the status of their mother. So here you can see how they even changed the laws to take on something that was unbiblical. Because in our book, in Numbers chapter 1 and 18, I'll grab it from the book instead of going through all the slides. Because we are a patriarchal society where our lineage, or the lineages are identified by the male, right? In our book, right here. Numbers chapter 1, verse 18. And they assembled all the congregation together on the first day of the second month, and they declared their pedigrees after their families by the house of their fathers, according to the number of the names from 20 years old and upward by their polls. So here they changed the custom of their lineages by the status of their mother. A local jury decided in Kay's favor, but an appeal to the general court ruled Kay was enslaved. A further appeal to the General Assembly was unresolved, and the case was enslaver apparently dropped their argument. In 1667, an enslaved man named Fernando sued for his freedom on the grounds that he was a Christian and had been several years in England, and even had written documentation in Portuguese on his baptism. However, his suit was dismissed. Fernando clearly believed his Christian status entitled him to freedom, but this idea probably came from his experience with the Portuguese or in England, not in Virginia. Later in 1667, the General Assembly clarified that conferring of baptism doth not alter the condition of the person as to his bondage or freedom. The act explained that some doubts have risen whether children that are slaves by birth should by virtue of their baptism be made free, indicating that some others in Virginia possibly wrestled with the same question, but there is no evidence of freedom for any baptized captives anywhere between 1619 and 1667. In neither Key nor Fernando's case did evidence of baptism or Christian status provide enough support for a successful claim to freedom. Most significant is that both enslaved individuals were held in bondage by their enslavers despite strong public evidence of their baptism, revealing that the overwhelming attitude among English colonizers in Virginia was that Christianity did not alter the status of enslaved people. So, what was the overall benefit of these so-called Negroes and or Indians taking on the customs of this religious practice of Christianity when it didn't free you from anything, but only conformed your mindset to integrate with colonialism, slavery, and indentured servitude? Indenturers were a form of legal contract evolved from the feudal system of the Middle Ages, in which an apprentice or servant was bound to a master for a set number of years, while under indenture, servants lacked some personal freedoms but still had legal protections. Indenture contracts could be bought and sold. Hmm. In Virginia, indentures were a key component of migration. Laborers bound themselves to landowners in return for their passage. Most laborers entered into indentures with merchants, ship captains, or planters, agents before boarding ships in England. Then their indentures were sold to planters when they arrived in Virginia. Yeah. I'm going to continue on for a little more. Uh, okay. So, I'll pick it up here. A small number of early white servants arrived from England without contracts and negotiated indentures with planters once in Virginia. In 1619, before the African landing, the First General Assembly passed legislation requiring the registration of all indentures to prevent uncontracted servants taking advantage of the widely circulated English common law dictum of a 1-year period of service for servants without a formal indenture contract. All records from Virginia indicate that Africans served far longer than their white indentured counterparts. So it is clear They were not treated as uncontracted indentured servants when they arrived. Moreover, there is no evidence Africans were included in the mandated registration of indentures. In 1643, the Assembly passed legislation setting standard terms of service for as yet indentured servants based on age. This law suggests it never was applied to Africans beforehand, and clearly did not apply to Africans at the time, since no documents recorded Africans' ages as they did for white servants. A very small number of Africans, like John Philip, were known to come from England. Some of this group may have been able to negotiate regular indentures, and this small group probably accounts for a disproportionate number of free blacks in early Virginia. It's starting to get a little hazy here, you know. They were first brought here, being sold as commodities, and now taking on these customs, religious customs to integrate, and now it's moving into an area where some may have freedom and purchase their freedom through so-called indentured servitude, as to where it was not. So it's a lot of it's starting to dilute the truth more and more, right? However, they usually could not prove their claim. Let's just start. Some Africans attempted to sue for freedom by claiming they were indentured servants. However, they usually could not prove their claim. For example, in 1655, John Kaser, a black servant of Anthony Johnson, testified that he was due his freedom after completing an indenture of 7 or 8 years. However, the court ruled in favor of Johnson, probably because Kaser could not produce a valid indenture contract or evidence. An indenture was recorded by the colonial government when he arrived in Virginia. A colonial government. Some opponents of the indentured servant theory of African status emphasize the use of Negro as a signifier of nationality, akin to Irishman, or other labels found in some very early Virginia records. However, these white nationality labels all but disappear from the record in the 1620s, whereas they persisted for Africans. Additionally, and more strikingly, there are no examples of ethnic labels also applying to children of whites, whereas Africans and their African American descendants were consistently labeled for generations as Negro. Some scholarly works and popular websites still describe Africans as indentured servants, but invariably they cite Breen and Inn's groundbreaking work on Anthony Johnson, Maine Owned Ground, as their source. This is a misreading of Maine Owned Ground, which claims that some Africans may have had experiences similar to white indentured servants, but does not argue that they were indentured servants. While the book is an important narrative, many of its broader claims, especially those applying Johnson's Eastern Shore experiences to other Africans in Virginia, have been criticized by prominent historians of slavery as exaggerated and unrepresentative of conditions in the rest of the colony. Even Breen and Innes concluded that all the Eastern Shore Africans probably arrived enslaved. Maine Owned Ground correctly points out that, while equality was not the experience of Africans in early Virginia, race was marginally more fluid than in the hardening racial lines that developed after the 1660s. However, Johnson's experiences were exceptional, and generalizations about the status of experience of blacks in early Virginia could not be derived from Johnson's biography. Slavery and the Law. Between the 1640s and 1705, Between the 1640s and 1705, Virginia's legal codes gradually constructed the rigid system of slavery in place of the 18th and 19th centuries. These series of laws did not anticipate the existence of slavery. Rather, these laws eliminated potential loopholes and reinforced a system already deeply embedded in Virginia's culture and economy. As with most aspects in English common law, the absence of written codes does not indicate the absence of a practical or legal reality. Slavery was legal in custom and in fact long before Virginia's slave codes were formally codified. I think some may refer to this definition of this piece of history as black codes. There's also black codes, right? Individual court records indicate slavery was the norm from at least the late 1620s. Despite the likelihood that nearly all of Virginia's early Africans were enslaved, no definitive documentary proof exists on an individual basis. The earliest documentation enslaved Africans in Virginia records may be the unnamed mother of Elizabeth Key, a mulatto woman who sued for her freedom in 1655. The suit referred to Kay's mother as enslaved, based on the dates of Key's birth. This would date the enslavement of Key's mother to the late 1620s. Her experience appears to have been typical. Similarly, Governor George Yeardley's 1627 will listed Africans separately from servants, indicating Africans were not considered to have the same status as white indentured laborers. Right? Key's mother, in the earliest person we can definitively prove was enslaved, but her story was not the first appearance of slavery in Virginia's records. While historical records indicate Key's mother was enslaved in the 1620s, those records were not written until Key's 1655 suit. The earliest appearance of an enslaved African in historical records is probably John Punch, or Bunch, who is recorded in 1640 as bound for life. An earlier case, 1625, also appears to imply an African named Brace was enslaved for life and considered the property of Sir Francis Wyatt. So now we see that nothing's new under the sun. You know, these slaves were taken from all kinds of, and put into bondage here and scattered to the four winds. This was all due to, us transgressing the laws and our forefathers as well. Are the first Africans. I'm trying to see where I can tile this. Okay. So, read this portion here. We'll probably close out. Other first Africans. Several theories have emerged which posit that America may have been discovered by Africans before the arrival of Europeans. Some Arab sources and oral accounts from Caribbean natives suggest that North Africans may have voyaged to America in the medieval period. Additionally, over the 20th century, some anthropologists theorize that Africans may have crossed the Atlantic and influenced the ancient Olmec culture of central Mexico, although there is no verifiable genetic or archaeological evidence to support this theory. The most compelling support comes from masks and sculptures of heads that seem to show African features. African features. However, this theory is not widely accepted among the scholars. So here is telling you right here that, okay, it's telling you right here in this portion, the first Africans, right, that there was a portion of so-called said Africans that may have discovered so-called America, they're calling it America, at this time before Europeans, right, and has traveled from northern parts of Africa and so on and made it over here, right, made it over to this continent. I'm going to highlight a verse or several verses in Second Esdras, found in the Apocrypha. Second Esdras, chapter 13, verses 40 to 44, and it reads, those are the 10 tribes which were carried away prisoners out of their own land in the time of Hosea the king, whom Salmanasar the king of Assyria led away captive, and he carried them over the waters, and so came they into another land. So we know that during the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel at the time, you find that in 2 Kings 7, chapter 17, in different portions where the kingdom split, right? Judah and the 10 tribes, they split and were taken into captivity through the Assyrians, right? And it reads that, in verse 40 in 2nd Esdras chapter 13, that they were taken away over the waters. Verse 41, but they took this counsel among themselves, that they would leave the multitude of the heathen and go forth into a further country where never mankind dwelt. So a land occupied by no one, to substantiate that this could be very well a fact that we're reading here in the 1619 Virginia's first Africans, right? Verse 42 of 2nd Esdras chapter 13, that they might there keep their statutes, which they never kept in their own land, and they entered into the Euphrates by the narrow passages of the river. For the Most High then showed signs for them and held still the flood till they were passed over. So the Most High made a passage for the Africans in the northern part to come to a land that never man dwelt, which could probably substantiate this first portion of what we're reading here, right? Picking it back up. Although there is no verified, okay, we read all of that sculptures. However, this theory is not widely accepted among scholars. Next point. Free and possibly enslaved Africans almost certainly made up part of the crews of Spanish conquistador ships, including Columbus' 1492 expedition. Archaeological excavations have unearthed African remains among those of Spanish conquistadors from the early 16th century. Spanish conquistadors first imported enslaved Africans to Hispaniola, present-day Haiti, and Dominican Republic in 1502. Spanish conquest depended on enslavement of native peoples by forced labor, cultural and environmental disruption, and waves of devastating epidemics caused native populations to collapse. Within 2 decades, the Spanish relied on Africans to replace native enslaved labor. The first documented enslaved Africans in the present-day United States were part of a Spanish expedition to present-day South Carolina in 1526. There, the Africans staged a rebellion, and the Spanish abandoned the settlement the next year. The Spanish brought enslaved Africans to St. Augustine, Florida in 1565. So, right here it says, within 2 decades, the Spanish relied on Africans to replace native and enslaved labor. The first documented enslaved Africans in present-day United States were part of the Spanish. And not too long ago, recently, the United States has recognized Africans being in this land of the United States and passed a bill, right? Passed a bill recognizing that the so-called Africans were here for a period of 400 years, right? HR 1242 on congress.gov says 400 years of the African American History Commission Act. And you can go through the bill and you can read a little bit, but to summarize what is being said here, with this acknowledgement of the United States identifying that it ties into a biblical prophecy as well, found in Genesis chapter 15, starting at verse, I think we'll start at verse 12. Let's go there real quick. Boom. Okay. Boom. See if it shows up. Right? Well, we'll start at 13. And he said unto Abram, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward they shall come out with great substance. So this prophecy, this timeline is tying into the acknowledgement of the bill that was passed, and from the initial landing of the first African slaves in West Virginia, I think it was West Virginia, in 1619. If we subtract 400 years from 1619, we come up with the date, 2019. And we know through prophecy and biblical scriptures that that period of servitude is the bondage that we had to serve for that period of time under this captivity, which would bring about our awakening, or the valley of dry bones now coming back together, right? To adhere to these laws and statutes and commandments and learn who we are and so on and so forth, and go into the history to be covered and brought underneath the blessings and the covenant, and have our Most High back to us, turn His face back to us, right? So I'll continue reading this on out there. Where am I at? Spanish conquistadors first imported enslaved Africans to Hispaniola, present-day Haiti, and Dominican Republic in 1502. So we know we have brothers and sisters spread out all over the world, right? He says we're a speckled bird, and He's going to cast us to the 4 winds. 4 winds. Spanish conquest depended on enslavement of native peoples by forced labor, cultural and environmental disruption, in waves of devastating epidemics, caused native populations to collapse. Within 2 decades, the Spanish relied on Africans to replace native enslaved labor. Okay. They know how to pick the best, don't they? The first documented enslaved Africans in the present-day United States were part of the Spanish expedition of present-day South Carolina in 1526. There, the Africans staged rebellion, and the Spanish abandoned the settlement the next year. The Spanish brought enslaved Africans to St. Augustine, Florida 1855. Enslaved Africans may have, my goodness, enslaved Africans may have been left at Roanoke Island, present-day North Carolina, by Sir Francis Drake in 1586. Drake led an English fleet in pillaging Cartagena and other colonial Spanish settlements. I think that's on Colombia. According to Spanish accounts, Drake stole at least 200 enslaved Africans and Turks, Ottomans, as part of his loot. Drake's fleet then sailed to St. Augustine and onto the Roanoke colony. 3 Africans left behind at St. Augustine reported that Drake intended to leave the remaining Africans at Roanoke to labor for the benefit of the colony there. However, surviving records do not confirm whether this plan was carried out. African sailors served on Dutch crews involved in founding New Netherland. Africans were known to be in the colony in 1612, and others were probably present earlier as crew members. Enslaved Africans were imported to Bermuda in 1616. The landing of 20-odd Africans in Virginia in 1619 is the most significant beginning for African Americans who lived enslaved between 1619 and 1865, as well as today's African American population. The first documented Africans in New France arrived in 1632. So now I see a new label, African Americans. So it started from Africans from the Kingdom of Ondongo, and then it went into Christian Negroes, and then Negro, and now we're looking at another term here, bywords. The scripture talks about us having different bywords, African Americans, right? So all praise to the Most High Yah. We will end it there, and I will pick it back up in another video. And I pray this was edifying and to the point. I pray that I had done my duty to bring forth some understanding to whoever who may benefit from this information. Until the next time, Shalom.